Hello everyone, my name is Kelly Anderson and I am a parent and I'm also the president and CEO of FamilySmart. If you're joining us tonight, we're super happy to have you join us. Our topic tonight is substance use, and we are looking at substance use through the lens of relationships. And so we hope that this time that you're going to spend either online or in community sites will give you something to think about around substance use. These in the Knows are a health literacy project brought to you by the BC Partners for Mental Health and Substance Use. We are one of the partners, and the funders are PHSA and the Ministry of Children and Family Development. So we have two amazing guests joining us tonight. Our guests are Dan Reist. Dan is a father, a grandfather, and associate director of the Canadian Institute on Substance Use Research. Thank you, Dan, for joining us to share your experience as all of those roles that you have, but also your expertise over the years in substance use. Our other guest tonight is Judith. Judith is a mom whose son struggled with substance use in his teens and developed an addiction which took his life at the age of 19. Judith, we're deeply sorry for your loss and grateful to you for sharing what you learned with your experiences with your son and just the grace that you have in being able to bring that to other people in hopes that it will help them. So thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to spend the next time with you just talking with Dan and Judith and seeing, hopefully, to give you some resources, but also just a conversation. So we've kind of divided things up into three messages around this topic. So the following areas are what we're going to cover in this time. Messaging about substance use. What we read, what we hear, I think it impacts what we do. And how messaging drives often how we feel, and then what it is that we react or what we say. And then our third thing that we're going to cover is about what has helped parents. And Judith is going to help us understand some of those things. Over the years, Dan has produced lots of tools for the province on how to help parents understand substance use, what's fact, what's fiction, kind of what works, what isn't in so much working, and then just talking about some of the other resources that parents have asked us for. Please give us something. So we hope we can do that tonight. So Dan, I'm going to start with the messaging. You and I have talked a lot over the years about messaging around substance use. But when teens hear or they see messaging about substance use and how it'll ruin their dreams, or how they could die from substance use, or an overdose, is it true? What I've been looking at lately is it true that the majority of teens, when they hear those kinds of messaging, they either don't believe that those things could possibly happen to them, or that they find the message like, yeah, that's way over the top. Like, what does messaging do for young people?
Yeah, it's part of the traditional approach to substance use has been this idea that if we simply tell people all of the negative things, it will make them not do it. And it's fallacious on a number of grounds. I mean, on the most extreme, those children who are most likely to get into trouble with substances tend to be those who are the greatest risk takers. So you tell a risk taker that something's risky, and you are actually encouraging them to follow that path. So that's one of the problems. But at a broader level, when we tell people one side of a story, we lose credibility. And it's true that these psychoactive substances can cause problems for some people. But it's also true that a vast majority of people who use them are using them for some kind of benefit. And if we don't include that in the discussion, they quickly dismiss us, just as they dismiss, ridiculous advertising claims of products. Okay. So that's one part of the messaging. I mean, there's many layers to this messaging issue that we could explore. But clearly, we do need to maintain credibility by telling an honest story as opposed to a one-sided story.
Yeah, so that whole notion that there's always two sides to every story. We all know that, right? But it doesn't get applied to certain messaging. And certainly what I'm hearing you say is that's the case with substance use. We tell the one side of the story. Yeah. And you're right, I think it makes it hard for young people to buy into that, right? Yeah. I think what you've said is it's not effective for teens. It's not effective for them.
That approach is definitely not effective.
Exactly. Okay. So Judith, part of what you have shared with me is just that you got very mixed messages along your journey with your son, and about what you should do. You know, you should be doing this, you should be trying this, don't do that. All of that kind of, you know, depending on who you talk to, you got a different theory. So can you just share a little bit about that? Because that's a different messaging again that parents are subject to.
Right. Yeah, I saw multiple counselors just trying to get some help as far as how do I parent him in a way that's going to be effective. And a lot of it was, yes, do this, but a lot of the counselors disagreed on what was the best approach and what I should do and how I should do it and what I should, you know, sort of let go of and what I should focus on. And it was confusing and frustrating because I didn't know which direction to go in.
Right. And I think
I remember it as a parent many times, my wife and I saying, you know, these little creatures should come with owner's manuals or operator's manuals. But the reality is that, of course, the reason those counselors give conflicting messages is that life is so complicated that it can't be manualized. We can't simply come up with the right answer, right? Yeah. And that's part of the challenge.
And
right?
I had two children, and some of the things that worked with one was definitely not working with the other. Right. And so that's confusing too, because you're like, well, it's working here. Why isn't it working over there?
So maybe part of the messaging that would be helpful for people is when people aren't so hard-lined when they're talking to parents about things, making it feel like, no, this is really the one that you should be doing. And the way that sometimes we're talked to as parents around the choices we should make, sometimes they can be very heavy-handed.
Absolutely.
And it's not helpful because you feel leaving like I must do that now.
Right.
And if I don't and it doesn't go well, then I'm going to be at fault for that.
Yeah.
So I think that for me is a really important piece about the discussion about substance use, is that you're right. One approach does not work for everyone.
And our systems that are there to support families and to support children are systems that are built around simplicity. We like simple messages, simple statements. And the reality is life is complex and it's nuanced, and we have to get much more comfortable with nuance. So, you know, examples are, we'll say something like, you know, parents are the best prevention. That came out of a US campaign a while back. And there's a level on which that is true, that parents supporting their kids can have a huge impact. But the way that can get interpreted at the parent level is, my kid's having trouble, therefore I screwed up. And that's not necessarily true, right? And so we need to be very careful that we don't get these one-line messages that while they may have one side that's true to them, they can also be misunderstood and communicate something quite hurtful on the other side.
Yeah, and one of the terms that I've heard a lot from parents in that regard is when the whole trauma came out. And I know that you know, when that came out, right, it was one of those terms around, so okay, they're taking a trauma approach. Does that mean that they're thinking that I traumatized my kid? And even if that wasn't the intention, there's this, as you said, there's words that get used. And when there's not enough unpacking of the words and putting context to them, they can feel judgmental for people. And I think that I would say, if in substance use, oh my goodness, there's so much stigma and so much judgment around people who have substance use challenges. Right? So I think that that kind of leads to them, if that's all the kind of messaging that goes on in our world, whether it's, whether it's our teens hearing it, it's us as parents, and whether we're hearing it from other parents, because, oh my gosh, parents do love to judge other parents. And so how, it's like, how does that messaging then live in us? How does that live in us, and how does it then impact what we say and do? And I've heard a lot of parents share with us that how that plays out for them is they feel afraid. They feel fearful. Oh my gosh, this must be true. If he uses that, he is going to be an addict. He is not going to finish school. All these things that we get fearful around. The shame, the blame, how alone, right? I mean, I think, Judith, you had talked about when you go to parties and stuff, people don't want to hear, they don't want to be talking to you about, they've already heard about your son, so we don't want to talk to her about that. So there's a lot of alone and isolation that happens when your kids are experiencing challenges. But then that sadness that, is this only me? Like, what did I do? Why is my kid? And then it feels like a lot of it isn't helpful. So one of the things that you talked about is fear. And I would say out of all the things that I have heard parents talk about that is behind the things that they come to us talking about is fear. And I'm wondering if you could tell us how you reacted because of that fear. And like, what did you say or do because of that fear? And what were your conversations with your son about because of the fear?
There definitely was a lot of fear, and it drove a lot of, I don't want to say illogical thinking, but sort of illogical thinking, in the sense that I didn't think it out long enough. It was impulsive because you are scared. A lot of the conversations and time that I did spend with my son, unfortunately, was me relaying to him that I'm worried, that I'm fearful, that why, please stop doing this. Why are you doing this? Without really ever getting any answers, because I wasn't approaching it in an approachable way. But yeah, definitely not helpful. The fear is not helpful at all. It's one thing I think that you definitely need to find a way around.
Yeah. And so when you would say those kinds of things to your son, what response did he have?
Well, the invincible, I'm fine. It's not going to happen. I'm fine. Everything's okay. Mom, I'm safe. A lot of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when that,
Just exploring that fear, because fear is, of course, one of our emotions that's useful at times. It's useful when we need that fight or flight kind of response, but it's not very useful for building a foundation for a relationship ongoing, and that's where I think the issue comes in. But it's worth stopping and pausing a moment to think, well, where does that fear come from? Yeah. And it comes from this kind of social discourse we have around substance use and drugs, that we have bought into that one-sided message to some degree. And even as parents and as grandparents, we often buy into these messages that are part of our social milieu. And sometimes we have to stop and question those messages ourselves. Is it really as stark as that? Or is there some sense in which your son is correct in saying, I'm fine? But then to help him question whether he's got it all either, or if there's not some sense in which your fear is also grounded. So it's actually finding the way to bring these multiple responses to this situation to bear on each other, so that I don't own all the fear and he owns all the I'm just fine, but that we actually find some ground in between.
Yeah.
I think, though, he did recognize that he wasn't necessarily fine, but wasn't wanting to quite deal with that, because he was still in his mind having a lot of fun, which I'm sure he was having. Like we talked about, there are the plus sides to what they're doing at times, and for him the fun was still outweighing the issues that it was causing for him. So
And you're right, Dan. There is a place of, one of our previous ITKs, we talked about collaborative problem solving, which is, you got plan A, which is the adult's plan, and then plan C, which is the kid's plan, and then where's the plan B in the middle? So that, yes, you don't have to be the holder of that whole thing of please don't use, like, I don't understand why you're doing that, and I'm afraid, and I'm owning all that, and then being on the other side where, yeah, you know what, just stop worrying so much. I mean, I know one of the moms I'm really good friends with, I mean, her son would just go, stop worrying so much. And she's going, like, how ridiculous, how can I not worry?
I'm a mom.
I'm a mom. And that really, it's such a natural instinct to be fearful for what your kids are doing and what that could mean. And so how do you navigate through that fear?
I think one of the important things is to be able to own it as mine, and be able to communicate it as mine, and not try to project it on the other. So if I can have a conversation in which I can explain my own emotional response and why I'm feeling that way, and what I'm exposing myself a little bit as a human being to my child, then they can become a little less defensive. Because when they're in that defensive mode, whatever you say, they're going to argue the opposite side. Yeah. But if they can just see you as exposing yourself, then they're a little more capable of maybe engaging then. So I think that's one of the pieces. It's not a magic formula that suddenly turns everything around, but it's an important step to own it as my fear.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing in that is just that, sometimes when our team of parents all get together, we all go, like, my kid doesn't even see me as human. Like, you're just a parent. You're just mom. You're, like, settle down. I think there's a place where we naturally think that we can't connect with our kids in a way to be honest with them. That our sole thing is to make sure that they do smart things and they don't take too much risks and that they graduate and they do all the things that teens are supposed to do. And then what gets lost in that, I would think and experience, that you lose some of that ability for them to see you as, you're a person, and you actually have you've got some stuff coming up for you that is about you, as you said, Dan, right? And how to have our kids see us as actually people, and not just people that just want to make their life miserable, because I often hear that from parents, right?
Yep.
Like, how do we just not be those people who just want to give you a hard time? And it's hard because it's a boundary around parenting and being the adult, but at the same time knowing that they're navigating a lot of hard decisions in those years, right?
And I think that comes... I think that's a wonderful thought, this idea of them not seeing us as human. And maybe we could turn that around and say sometimes we don't see them as human. We see them as something that we hope to turn into human. And so by us acknowledging our own fallibility, which is to acknowledge our own humanness, we might be able to also then see them as human, not just something that we need to mold and shape in order to, but that something we need to interact with in their growing process.
Right.
So I think it cuts both ways on that.
Which is interesting, right? Yeah. But one of the things that I appreciated that you've shared about and pay attention to was that when you could see that bad things were happening, right, for your son because of his substance use, you talked about him not having the ability, he had lost his ability to see that they were bad. And that lack of awareness and reflection, it seemed to be missing, and you noted that. And it made you really realize that he's gone to a different place, because now he doesn't even have that awareness that these things that are happening are bad, and you don't even see that they're bad.
So I think he may have seen that they were bad, because he could say, this happened. I think he was in denial about maybe how bad it was and how often things would go badly. So I think he was aware there were problems with it, but just not at a point where he was ready to deal with it.
Okay.
So it was easier to say it's not a problem. But deep down, there were times he would admit, yes, it is a bit of a problem, but I'll be fine.
Right.
Yeah,
Minimizing,
very
Right.
much.
like that.
And don't we all do that to some extent? You know, I'm a procrastinator. I procrastinate, knowing that I should really get on to doing it, but I don't quite
Right.
have the motivation to do it, you know, or I haven't thought it through carefully enough or whatever. You know, we all have ways of putting off these
Yeah.
decisions that we have to make in
Yeah.
life. So.
Well, I think that some of the things that parents ask is like, how can I recognize? Like, what are those things that are notable between my teen going to parties and, you know, people are drinking and some people are using, other substances. But as a parent, what are some of the things that I might notice that I should pay more attention to than some other things? What are those kind of indicators? And what I thought when I heard that from you was when those kinds of things went, they were worse than he even could recognize. No, they're bad. No, they're really bad.
And worse than some of the things that, even though some of his friends were using, they were worse things happening with him than there were with his friends, probably because of the amount that he was using or his recklessness towards it, whereas his friends may still have been using substances, but they seemed more cautious, did it less often, to a lesser degree.
Okay.
I want to reflect on that for a moment because in my career, I've produced some of those lists that you're asking for of what are the signs that you should look for. I'm a bit skeptical about them on the whole.
Okay.
Because every time I would write one of these, I would realize that anything on that list could be normal. In fact, everything on that list could be normal. And yet, of course, there is a sense in which it's true that if, you know, these are also signposts.
Yeah.
But I have a new piece of advice that I'm trying to practice, and that is be curious.
Yes.
Instead of worrying about checklists of signs to look for, which puts us on this kind of surveillance perspective, just be curious and try to encourage curiosity in our children so that we can actually have a conversation that explores what is really going on. Is it really all benefit? You know, what about some of those shadows? You know, this is language that's not so hard and fast, but it's language that encourages curiosity. And I wish I had been way more curious with my own kids. I try to practice that with my grandkids now, not always successfully. But I think that's a better stance than a surveillance stance. Just encourage curiosity and encourage them to also join you in your curiousness.
Interesting. One of the things I've heard, and I think it was a school principal shared with us, that your kids can tell when you are trying to be a detective versus actually deeply interested in understanding, to know a little bit more about why they're doing what they're doing. So it's like if you're digging to actually get dirt to find out which party are they going to tonight and who's going to be there, he said it's just kids back away from that kind of probing. And I think that's speaking to that surveillance you're talking about.
That's right.
But oh my gosh, where do you get these skills as a parent? Like, how do you get this? Because that's what I know parents are going to watch this and go, how the heck do I get the language to now be curious and not be a prober? How do we do that?
Well, I would say, first of all, take a deep breath and realize that we'll never be perfect, right? So,
True.
So it's not about doing it perfectly. And so then it's like any other skill in life. It's about being reflective about it and trying to practice, you know, and practice works best when it's not in crisis situations. So learning to take some of these principles and try practicing them in our normal day-to-day life and interactions, as opposed to in those contexts when we suddenly, oh my God, there's something happening, and we pull out these sort of styles of interaction, then it's not going to work. But if we actually make it part of our normal way of being, then I think it can pay off in dividends. So I'd say don't panic about it, but just start practicing it.
Yeah. Well, and that's maybe an area where when we think about what more can we do for families, maybe that what more can we do for families is to be able to start putting that kind of messaging out there for people to hear. Right? How do we give people, you know, there's a lot of parenting courses, and oh my gosh, and you probably know, you were probably recommended to go to lots of them, right? Just like I was. But the messaging in a lot of parenting courses is, it made me feel bad about myself, which didn't help me to come to a place to feel like I was competent to help him. And so if I don't feel that, how can I come alongside him, right? So that would be an interesting thing for us to be able to talk through and actually connect with families and go like, let's talk about how we can actually develop some of this in ourselves. And you're right. Oh my gosh, the time to try something is not in a crisis.
No.
Right?
Definitely not.
But
no, even if it seems like it in the moment, it's not. Definitely not.
Right? It's like we know it intuitively, but we can't help but go to that place. And I always think about how fear enters our body again, and it's like, oh my gosh, I need to stop them from going out tonight, or I need to say this to them right now. And it's in that moment of urgency, that urgency, I think, can sometimes paralyze us from doing the things that would be better to do, but the urgency makes us do the things we always do, which most of the time didn't work.
Yeah.
But that's where we're going to go. That's our go-to now. So I think that advice to think about how we do that when our kids are younger, but also ongoing, and it's never too late to start a way of trying to do things differently with our kids. And that, for me, Judith, really talks about when you talk about what helped you turn a corner. And you mentioned a book you read called Beyond Addiction.
Yes.
And again, one thing that works for one parent doesn't mean it's going to work for another parent, but it's keeping yourself open to seeking. There's going to be something somewhere that speaks to you, and that book spoke to you.
It really did.
Yeah, and so what I'm hoping that you can share with people is just say that some of the things that really stand out for you that you learned from that book and what it did for you as far as your relationship with your son.
Well, part of it is somewhat like Dan was saying. There was a lot of, they were checklists, but in the sense, questions to ask yourself. There was a lot of questioning, why would he be doing this? What are the benefits for him? What would be the benefits if he stopped? You know, they're just, what would be the benefits to him they made me question so much of, and also of the way I had been doing things. It told you, step back, don't react now. You know, they encouraged you to read the whole book before you really did anything, and to just slow down, and yes, take the onus off yourself that you can't control this, that you can be there for them and try and support them. Yeah. But it took, for me, reading that book took the fear away from me. And it changed my relationship with my son a lot. It made him more willing to talk to me because I was more questioning and more inclined to go out and just hang out and have a coffee with him and not be talking about his substance use or why he was, homeschooled or whatever it was. It was just being able to talk about, well, what do you like? What do you enjoy doing? Who are you hanging out with? Did you have fun? Oh, you went snowboarding. How, and not talk about it. And it talked about, if you are going to have a conversation with your child around substance use, to pick a time that's good for them. Not for you, but when is a time that's good for them? And it talked a lot about meeting them where they are and the fact that he doesn't have to quit, but that pre-contemplation, because like I said, he would say, I know sometimes I do too much. That idea that he's in a state, he's at least aware that maybe down the road, so that gave me some hope even. It doesn't have to be now. But yeah, mostly the big piece was it took the fear away for me and improved the relationship with my son.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things there that I think are really, really interesting. One is that questions are way more powerful than answers. And so often we think we have to have the answers, and really we have to be willing to ask questions, but not questions that are what some call fake questions, the questions that I already know the answer to, or the questions that are the detective asking to try to collect all the facts so I can bust you. But questions that come from a true sense of curiosity. What is going on in your life? Those kinds of questions are way more powerful than answers. The other thing was this idea of when you were having that conversation with your son, and he makes an admission that, well, maybe I do use too much occasionally. Miller and Rolnick call that change talk, and it's really to gently get them to explore that more. So when they do offer an opportunity for change, not to jump on it as if, oh wow, you admitted it, I've been telling you that for years, but rather being able to really probe with them, well, what does that mean for you? Like, what makes you think that? Because the more they talk about it, the more they think about it. The more they think about it, the more open they become to analyze it. They learn through their own unpacking it. Not through me unpacking it for them, through them unpacking it. So I think that's a really a great thing that you learned from the book, was how to kind of probe and help them reach that point.
Yeah, and the other thing that when you were talking about slowing down, there's nothing that will get you moving faster, your heart rate, your movements, everything, than that fear and that urgency, right? And I gotta fix this, I gotta do this now. It becomes this, again, urgent thing that drives us. And it makes us say things, it makes us do things in an urgent manner. And when you said you slowed down, we did an exercise yesterday with our staff about breathing and counting your breaths. And I had never done it before, and I thought, and I thought I was doing pretty good. I think I had 18 breaths, and there's some people in the room that had 3 in a minute. And I'm going, and I had 18? All of a sudden, I didn't look so good. And it's like that slowing down and what that can do to help us respond differently. And I think that's what I heard from you, is just that slowing down and being able to know, I'm not going to fix this all. And I'm certainly not fixing this all right now. But how do you take, and when you said that it's not your job. So that's why this whole conversation, we talked about responsibility, relationships versus responsibility. Because your responsibility is the relationship, not the responsibility for him to make better choices or not use substances or all of that, right? And it feels like that's what you got out of that.
I definitely did, because with that slowing down, I think it encourages you to be kinder and more empathetic. And because, you're not reactive. You slowed down and just see things from another perspective. That's, I think, a big piece of that book, is it makes you see things from their perspective, not just your own. It admits, yes, you're fearful, but that has to go, and you need to look at it from a different perspective, and one that you don't own that.
Yeah.
But the other thing I wanted to mention as well that I think is important is I wish I had read that book years before I did. I think almost any parent could benefit from it, whether their child is at a point of using substances or not. I just think it has lots of valuable information in it to encourage your kid in a good path.
Right. Yeah, and I know I was, when we were talking about the title of it, Beyond Addiction, it's don't wait until there's an addiction. I think it's what you're saying. You could have used it way before then.
Yes, I could have used it when he was 5. That kind of an idea.
Just a different way of being with each other.
Yeah.
Right? That connection that we need to retain with our kids, right? Yeah. And
as you say, that fix-it reflex is so powerful in us because it's part of what we have been told as a society, from our society, that we're responsible for our kids in that way, and we have to fix them when they get out of line and all of that. And of course it's impossible if they are human beings and we are human beings that need to interact and engage one another in a much more interhuman being
Yes.
process as opposed to this
Yes.
kind of dominant, fixing, protecting kind of
Right.
model.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, a book that helps us just change our perspective on our role in society is such an important piece. So.
Yeah.
That's been my number
Yeah.
one takeaway since my son passed away, that if I could change anything, I would have loved him more and tried to fix him less.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I heard you say it along with that was that because we know how much love we have for our kids and we feel like we're showing it to them, we're giving it to them, it doesn't mean that they know it and that they feel it.
No.
And so how do we also again come from seeing each other as human beings, and just because I think I'm, maybe that's not how it's being received by them.
Yeah. I think with most teenagers it's probably not, because
Right.
yeah. I think it's a lot about thinking about what are you doing to make them feel loved, not what are you doing to try and make them stop using.
Right.
Yeah. And to spend more time trying to do things to make them feel loved than to stop them from using.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you
Yeah.
can't control that.
Yeah. One of the things, Dan, that you were talking about in a little bit earlier was how there is everything is just about the harms of substance use. That there's this balance of benefit and harm. Now, I know if parents are watching, they're going to go, "What do you mean benefits? How can we? Please help me understand what the benefit is to my kid using."
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, it's again because of the dominant discourse that we're exposed to, where we always think of substance use in its negative, especially when we associate that with young people. But if we just pause for a moment and think about our own use of psychoactive substances, whether that be alcohol or whether that be caffeine or any of the others, we use them for a reason. And human behavior is always motivated for a reason. And that reason might be a physical reason to alleviate pain, for example, or it might be a social reason to get up enough nerve to ask that girl to go to the dance with me, or whatever kids do these days. And those are all benefits that they perceive, and they're very real to them. Or it might be about belonging. So navigating their belonging, their identity within groups in the social networks are all connected with the use of substances. So there's lots and lots of benefits.
Yeah.
And of course, we also know that there are some harms. And so are there other ways than using substances to get those benefits? Can I use substances sometimes to get the benefit, but use other mechanisms other times to get the benefit, so that we don't get trapped in just one pattern of use, etc. So it becomes a much more nuanced conversation when we truly recognize the complexity of benefits are always driving behavior, but harms are always there too. And we accept that for most things in life.
So I think one of the things I've heard you say for a long time is this whole notion that we have scare tactics. We have scare messaging around substance, that thou shalt not use, right? This whole abstinence thing. We should we just need to tell kids not to get into substance use.
Yeah, and to try to help them find other ways to get the benefits. But there are times, and I remember listening to one young man who was, I think, about 15 at the time, and his mom explaining how he was using cannabis to manage his anxiety issues, and how they had gone through this whole process. And he was so articulate about how cannabis was actually giving him benefits that none of the medications that had been prescribed for him were able to give him. And how they, as a family, had to work this through and came to a place that was right for them, where the benefits were being recognized and the potential harms were also being recognized, and how to mitigate those harms in various ways. And it was just fascinating to listen to a family who had dealt with this challenge and found a way to deal with the fear on the parents' side, to deal with the benefits that were being perceived from the son's side, to acknowledge that there were risks, and to find ways through all of that. So.
And just speaking even of that, and I know it's not, well, it doesn't seem to be a popular thought, but looking back, I know there are drug testing kits that you can buy. They're all over the place, and if I believe, looking back, that had I been able to say to my son, I wasn't aware of it at the time, but I know you are using substances. Please at least take this with you. Test your drugs before you use them. If you're going to be, at least be as safe as you can with it, with that idea of reduce the harm in any way that you can.
Right.
Because I'm not saying that I want you out there doing drugs, but I know you are doing them. This is a way to keep yourself safer.
Right. And so when you talked about going and just having coffee with your son, I think that whole idea of trying to have conversations where we can get a better understanding from our kids of what is the benefit to them, just so I can understand, right?
Right.
So you're right. Everything in life we do stuff because it benefits us in one way or another. And why would substance use be any different?
Yeah, it's about having these grown-up conversations with our kids, right? By grown-up, I mean that we actually recognize our own agency, our own roles and our responsibilities, but we also recognize their agency. That this is not me extending myself into them. It's about having a conversation with them, helping them to experience life and make sense of what they're experiencing all along the way.
Yeah.
And of course, as they're really young, we make more decisions sort of on their behalf. As they grow up, we have to let that go, and it's no easy transition. But clearly, as they get into their teens, we have less and less where we can control, and we need to let go of that control. It's no longer a responsibility. They are agents, and that's part of the language issue that you started with too. That I think is important. We have language that kind of labels people who use drugs, particularly those who use drugs and get into trouble with it, in ways that take away their agency, as if they have no control. And by using that kind of language, we actually make an excuse for them not to be responsible for their behavior. And so we need to watch our language around addicts and drug abusers, and turn to language more about people who use drugs, and then we can have conversations about why and how they could use them more effectively, as opposed to this kind of assumption that they are not agents, they're not morally responsible agents, or however we want to categorize them.
And I think that's one of the things, Judith, when you talk about if you wished you'd had that book earlier, and what it did for you once you had that book, and knowing now that that you've lost your son, but what you gained in those last year of his life. I think that's a powerful message for families, and just being able to share with them, like, because they're going to go, what exactly did you do, and what exactly did you say to your son in that time that you didn't even know that's how short it would be? But what did you do and say?
Talked a lot less about his use. I had always made the consequence of his use his own, like I wouldn't bail him out, but I stopped talking about the consequences unless he wanted to talk about it. Just in general, spent more time just with him without talking about his use. He was very open for the most part about, talking about, what party he was going to, who was going to be there. He was great about giving me his friends' phone numbers because he knew I would worry, because he would often be out of contact, but at least I could text his friends. So there was just a lot of the more relaxed, joking around, like actually the night he passed away, we were joking around before he left, and he wanted me to drive him, but I'm like, well, are you going to a party well, nope, but I can pick you up when you need me to. And he was like, yeah, no, you're right, and just laughing and just making it him the agent, or however you want to phrase it, that these are your choices, and I don't always support them, but I love you. Yeah.
I think that the important thing there is, it's kind of like people like to get their kids in cars because you can have conversations. I hear lots of parents say that, but if all your conversations...
Preston did not like to get in the car with me. Not, in the last little while it was okay, but before that, yes, he did not like to get in the car with me because he was trapped now.
Right?
Yes.
So I think that's had actually a really great way to summarize our conversation is how do we come alongside our kids in a way that they don't feel like they're being trapped
Yeah.
and interrogated.
Yeah.
Because what I've heard you both say is it doesn't build a connection. And when we don't build a connection and we can't build that relationship, you're distant to them.
Yeah.
And they'll avoid you. And then you've lost any ability to influence their choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I love the image that I think you kind of brought into the conversation early on, that humanizing in language, that just as we want our children and our grandchildren to see us as humans,
Yes.
that we need to treat them as humans. And if it can
Yes.
be a human-to-human relationship, then we don't trap people, we trap things, right? And so we've got to just kind of think, am I treating them as a human being?
Right.
Even as we want to be treated as a human being in return. So
Absolutely.
And I do think the fear comes into that, because when you can let go of the fear, you know, that idea that somebody's substance use or their addiction defines them, you can stop that from defining them. And that was part of that book for me, is I took a lot of the focus off the substance use and just focused on him. And what are the things that I love about him? And, you know,
Yeah.
letting go of the fear, it allows you to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And recognizing that the drug use doesn't define them.
Great. That's really amazing insight, that I know that families they'll still struggle, because let's face it, as families we struggle. But at least knowing that there's another way. There's another way that we can consider, because we never say that this is going to work for every family and every family can do this. What we're saying is it's another way to think about it. And I so appreciate you both being able to give that message. I know that the people that watch it online are going to love it. I know that when they get together in communities with our PIRs, there'll be a lot of discussion that comes from this. And I know what parents are going to ask is, oh my gosh, I need to have the language. I need to, and what I want to just say, as you say, it's like, take your time. And you're not going to get everything right away. Even if you just take one little opportunity to try something a little bit different, and try it when you're not in crisis.
yeah. And then reflect on it afterwards, not in a way of holding yourself accountable in a kind of a blaming way, oh, I blew that, but just what worked there, what didn't, how could I
Yes.
learn from that?
Yes.
And always being reflective about our own stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you again. And so for those of you that are watching, it's really important that we hear feedback, because the feedback that we get on these allow us to then go, okay, this really worked. Again, the reflected. What worked for families? What did they really like about this ITK? What more do they want from the next one? So there is a survey after this that you can find online, and in your community there's a link to it. Please take the couple of minutes to just give us feedback, because we always look at it and we go, okay, we're going to change it up a bit. We're going to try this next time. Here's something else that we want to add next time. And so please do that for us. We so appreciate you, and thank you for joining us tonight.